Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released next-gen upgrade to Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, and see what improvements, if any, there have been over the original releases of the game on the PS4, PlayStation 4 Pro, Xbox One, and Xbox One X. Additionally, we're going to take a look at the new Switch release as well, which has quite a few interesting changes in order to make it playable at an acceptable performance level. Now, for those of you that don't know, Crash Bandicoot 4 first released last year for PS4 and Xbox One, and is a direct follow-up to the original trilogy of Naughty Dog platformer games from back in the late 90s. The game's story kicks off directly after the events of Crash Bandicoot Warped, and a lot of the gameplay mechanics are built to mirror that same hybrid platformer style that fans loved in the original games. However, there are several completely new features mixed in as well, including new characters to play as, changes to the gameplay mechanics, and a unique new art style, giving it more of a Saturday morning cartoon feel. So now that the game is released on new hardware, let's take a look at what improvements you can expect, starting with the improvements to the resolution and the performance. With the original PlayStation 4, Crash 4 struggles quite a bit. The game looks great, outputting at what appears to be a native 1080p resolution, but the frame rate has trouble obtaining its 60 FPS target, and more often than not, it sits in the 30 to 40 FPS range instead. It's a really sluggish experience and not ideal for a game that requires such precise platforming. This is cleaned up substantially with the mid-gen PS4 Pro, where the game almost always maintains 60 FPS. However, it too is stuck outputting at only 1080p, giving the overall presentation a slightly muddy appearance. Because of the cartoony nature of the game, this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but after jumping to the new PlayStation 5 version, there's really no going back. The PS5 version of Crash 4 targets a gorgeous native 4K resolution, with only some minor scaling being applied here and there, at a solid 60 FPS with no distinguishable dips throughout. It looks incredible and gives each of the game's environments a much cleaner, polished look, making it one of the best ways to play this new game. Meanwhile, over on the Xbox, we have more or less the same story. The Xbox One unfortunately only manages to output at around 900p, with a similar target 60 FPS that it often fluctuates around. But the Xbox One X is a big improvement, with a 1080p output and locked 60 FPS, just like with the PS4 Pro. Then of course, the jump to next gen offers a native 4K output at 60 FPS as well, making it the ideal Crash 4 experience for owners of Xbox hardware. Now, I wasn't able to test the Series S version as I don't own that particular console, but according to Activision, it too will target 60 FPS and aims for a 4K resolution, albeit with some dynamic scaling in play, and it too is a marked improvement over the old-gen versions of the game. But for the most part, each of these competing consoles, despite slightly different hardware specs in each respective category, provides basically the exact same presentation. The differences between the PlayStation 5 and Series X in particular are practically impossible to notice, with the only difference I was able to find being a slight loading advantage for the PS5. What's more, the difference between next-gen and original releases of the game are pretty negligible as well. Yes, the performance is now more stable and the upgrade to the output resolution is fantastic, but you otherwise would be hard-pressed to find any differences to things like the character model complexity, environments, or effects quality. However, when looking at the brand new Switch release of the game, things get a bit more interesting. The Nintendo Switch is of course not quite as powerful as the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, and so the developers behind this port of the game had to make quite a few visual sacrifices to make it play properly. The Nintendo Switch release of Crash 4 targets a locked 30 FPS for both docked and portable mode, outputting at only 720p and 540p respectively. This is a big hit to the visual presentation, but it's also not the only thing that had to be scaled back. I looked at everything from the character models to the various effects and found that the Switch version either had to modify some assets or remove them entirely. Now, I first looked closely at various character models, both in-game and during the cinematic cutscenes, and thankfully these appear more or less the same regardless of which version you plan on playing on. Yes, the PS5 and Xbox Series X versions feature the sharpest image, but that all boils down to the resolution, not so much the complexity of the model itself. And the environments are somewhat the same story. It's difficult to spot any differences between these versions, at least when looking at the PlayStation and Xbox releases. But when looking at the Switch version, there's quite a few environmental textures that are greatly simplified, like these shells in the sand, or the wood and stone structures that decorate the main path. These aren't necessarily things that you're going to notice, but it's still a downgrade nonetheless. Then we have the lighting. Crash 4 utilizes a lot of baked-in lighting effects with some nice incorporation of various god rays in certain scenes. But the Switch version removes a few of these light shafts throughout. Thankfully, they're usually the less noticeable areas, so the more prominent light rays like the ones near this temple are still intact. But there's other areas where you'll notice things like reflective puddles and the nice specular lighting along stone walls have been removed. Additionally, as John Linman pointed out in his early analysis of the game, there's also some instances of dynamic lighting effects that are weirdly missing from the Switch release, mainly the lighting effects at this series of columns in the first level. Though it's such a strange omission considering most of the dynamic lighting effects still remain intact. Aku Aku will still light up the area as he flies by this temple at the start, and there's still lightning flashes with this tunnel and during the climb at the end. The shadow quality is where things get a bit more interesting. Once again, the PlayStation and Xbox are practically indistinguishable in this area. But on the Switch, we can easily recognize a significant degradation to the quality, with blurry shadow projections of both the player model and various environmental props, to completely missing shadows of objects in the distance. This area in particular has seen the removal of almost all the shadows from the vines along the wall, which really takes away from the depth of the scene, something that becomes more and more prevalent as you reach increasingly more complex areas. Then of course we have effects. Generally, the effects are identical across all platforms, including the Switch. All the stylized explosions, smoke, and fire look about the same. But there's still a few minor changes throughout, like the removal of the white foam from the water on this beach, and a change to the shader that changes the coloration of the water surface itself. A lot of the environmental particle effects have also been scaled back, like the fireworks in this Mardi Gras style level, which doesn't deliver the same way it does on the Xbox or PlayStation. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. I'm not really expecting much of a difference between versions, as they should in theory sound the same based on how it's being recorded. So really, this should serve as more of an extended sample of not only how these games sound, but also how they look and play in action. So, what do you guys think? Which version do you think looks and sounds the best? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Crash Bandicoot 4 plays its absolute best on both the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 consoles. There isn't any noticeable improvement to the various graphical effects like character models or environments with these new platforms. But the huge upgrade to the output resolution, along with the more stable 60 FPS performance, makes a huge difference in delivering a more polished experience. Additionally, depending on the system that you're playing on, players will also be able to take advantage of specific new hardware features, including the enhanced controller feedback of the PlayStation 5's DualSense, Xbox's smart delivery that made transferring save data a little bit easier, and both systems vastly improved loading times. but the Switch version is a pretty big step back. It's a perfectly playable experience with a relatively solid 30 FPS, just like the N-Sane trilogy. But unless you really want to play Crash 4 portably, there's little reason to choose the Switch version over any other version of this game. But what do you guys think? Do you mind the visual sacrifices that had to be made to the Switch version? And are you impressed with the next-gen implementation of the game on PS5 and Series X? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.